Hello, good evening,
Good
sir.
evening, sir.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
sir, clearly.
Oh, excellent.
Good evening, everybody present. Welcome to the 107th informal discussion group session with Mr. Nandan Kamath, an eminent sports lawyer, founder of Law NK, and managing trustee of Go Sports Foundation. The topic for this session is why sports matters. Sir, I would like to thank you on behalf of everybody present here for taking out time and agreeing to have this session with us. I would like to invite Tushmi Udyalak to introduce the guest for the audience.
Thank you.
Good evening to everybody present in the 107th IDG session with Mr. Nandan Kamath. I'm sure we're all enthralled and excited to hear from the sports genius himself on why sports matters. But before that, I would like to introduce Sir to the audience. Mr. Kamath is the principal lawyer at Law NK. He graduated with a BA LLB honors from the National Law School University, BCL and MSc degrees from the University of Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship, and an LLM from Harvard Law School. He acts as managing trustee of Go Sports Foundation, a non-profit that provides scholarship and support to junior Indian athletes. Mr. Kamath has worked at David Polk and Wardwell as an associate for 3 years during 2003 to 2006. His news articles are an eye-catcher for most of us as he engages with contemporary topics of sports, technology, media law, non-profits, and entrepreneurship. His clients range from international and national sports federations to leagues, teams, sponsors, and athletes. Mr. Kamath is also a camp ambassador and acts as a professional mediator. We're looking forward to an enlightening session with Sir, and on this note, I would like to hand over to Tanish. Thank you.
Thank you, Tushmi. In order to make the most of this session, I would request the attendees to please keep their microphones on mute and post any questions that you may have in the chat box. Now, without further ado, I would like to hand over to Mr. Kamath. Sir, sir, I think you are on mute.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction, and lovely to be among all of you, young to-be lawyers. It's been a while since I've been in law school, but I think it's an exciting time for all of you, and nice to engage. So I'm going to be talking very briefly. I think the point is it's a discussion group, so it would be great to have all of you actively participating both on video and audio as well. But I'll just give you a brief introduction to myself. So I was a cricketer at a junior level. So I used to play quite serious cricket until I was about 17 or 18. Then did the admission exam for the National Law School. We didn't have CLAT or CLAT or whatever at that point. One of my friends was doing the exam, so I went ahead and did the entrance test as well, and got in a little bit to my own surprise. And at that point, I had to make a significant decision on whether to carry on playing cricket, which I was playing at the state level. So I was playing for Karnataka State, captain the under-16 team, and was actually on track to be playing much more serious cricket. But one thing we do share between NLS and NUJS is Professor Madhav Menon, and he did my interview. And I remember that very, very distinctly, where he sits down and says, okay, Nandan, decide, are you going to be a cricketer or a lawyer? And it's not really a decision I'd really thought about. I thought you could be many things at the same time. But unfortunately, it was a little bit of an ultimatum there, because the very strict attendance requirements, which I'm sure the legacy continues to all of you, to much to your chagrin. But it was either one of those choices. And I took that choice to follow the law. The sports world was very different at that point of time. There was no IPL. There was no, maybe 8 or 10 people made a career out of cricket at that time. It sounds a little bit unusual when you say it at this point of time where so much has changed. But I made that decision, followed the law, worked hard at law school, got lots of different opportunities after that. But in many ways, life has come full circle, because I've come back to sport as a lawyer and using my legal skills in multiple different ways. So I consider myself, among many different things, I consider myself a lawyer, but I'm also multitude of different interests and different things I do with my life. Having a legal education has been incredibly empowering, given me a much wider view than I would have got in most other sort of situations. But I was able to bring back the love for sport, the appreciation I had for what sports had done for me back into my profession. It was not an easy ride. After my master's degrees, I came back to India in 2006 after having worked for 3 years in California. I worked on corporate law, intellectual property, M&A, capital markets. Came back and I felt like it was important to do something I was interested in and where I felt I could add value. I thought it would be good to do technology law, other things I'd worked on. But I had a lot of friends who had played cricket, played sport, and knew that I was a lawyer. And slowly I got a few requests here and there. Can you help me with a contract? Can you help me with something else? So in some sense, my intention was to do sports law, but it wasn't like there were too many opportunities. In many ways, the opportunities, I grew into the opportunities that were created, for example, with the IPL coming in, sport being taken a little bit more seriously, and particularly documentation, transactions, and contracts. But what I'd done alongside also was co-found Go Sports Foundation, which was a non-profit to support the journeys in many ways of Olympic and Paralympic hopefuls. And to me, it took me back to the time when I was doing that interview with Dr. Menon, and he said, choose one of the two. And I just felt, looking back on that, it was a reasonably unfair choice. I wish I didn't have to make that choice, and I could have done both for a bit longer. But I did make that choice, and I just felt the desire to change a little bit of the narrative, change a little bit of the odds, which was so much in favor of this being a binary choice between being an athlete and being a lawyer or anything else that is quasi-academic. So that organization has grown wonderfully over the last 15 years or so. And this time we're sending almost 20 people to the Olympics, another 25 or 30 people to the Paralympics, all people who have been supported by the foundation. So that's been another part. And the third part of my life is, as part of our firm, we do a fair bit of policy work, and we've set up the Sports Law and Policy Center, which in fact has its symposium next week. If any of you are interested, I encourage you to sign up. It'll be an exciting couple of days. So we're going to be talking about women's cricket and its development and its status in relation to the sports movement in general. So that's where I stand in the things I've done. My strong belief is in the significant importance of sport. And I say this having worked now for 15 years in sports governance. And to me, it really comes back to why we exist, what we care about, and what we together want to give meaning to in many ways. So just to start, I would love to understand from all of you, how many of yourself, I don't know if you can use the hands up feature, but how many of you consider yourselves sports enthusiasts? I'm not sure I can see all of these videos. There are lots of different people. So you have some sports enthusiasts. Not everyone is a sports enthusiast. Do you think that what the decisions made in sport and sports governance are relevant to you? Are they of interest? Are they relevant? How many people think that whether or not you're a sports fan, they are relevant? Okay. Some of you think so. On the other hand, how many of you are interested in things like gender policy and gender rights? How many of you are interested in intellectual property? How many of you are interested in technology policy? So the reality is there is no real difference between sports policy and all of these, because in many ways, in my view, sports governance world and sports itself, organized sport, is the world's largest social experiment and the historical social experiment. I mean, there are other things that compete, such as the internet and just the way it's changed information, but in a multivariate, sort of relevant way, sport actually battles every single challenge that society is facing. In many cases, battles it first. And I'll come to why I think so, and I will be happy to open up the discussion. But when you think of things like gender, when you think of things like intellectual property, when you think of things like data protection and whose data and who can collect it in what instances, You can think of broadcasting. You can think of even just simple non-legal issues such as social mobility. How many other things are there in this country where you start doesn't predetermine where you begin? In many ways, just the universality of sport, the simplicity of sport means that regardless of what education you have got, regardless of where you're born, if that talent exists, it is one of the true and I'd say pure forms of social mobility possible in the country at this point of time. So, I mean, look at the sociology of sport, look at the legality of sport, and I'll come to a very specific one, which I'd like to open the discussion with. How many of you believe that chess is a sport in which men have an advantage over women? Men have an advantage. Can we just discuss why? Anyone want to begin? Does someone want to moderate? Tanish, you want to moderate? And it's not very clear to me who wants to.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
One participant had raised his hand. I think if he wants to discuss, I think its name is Samvid Rajwar.
Yeah, go ahead. Well, why do you think men have an advantage over women in chess?
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't think that like it's a advantage that has like people who are actively trying to discourage women from sport, but I think advantage in the sense that if you collect data of the sample size of the amount of men who are in chess and the sample size of women who are in chess, you can see that proportionally men are 10 or 11 times more into like participating in chess. So which is one of the reasons why there are not as many grandmasters, female grandmasters in chess, not just in India but like worldwide. So which is why I raised my hand.
Okay. Now, I'll ask a very simple question. So there are lots of sports. Most of them are segregated in very different ways, right? So you can segregate it by age, which is you play under 16, under 19, open categories. You can segregate it by weight category. For example, in weightlifting, you have different weight categories because someone who's bigger built may be stronger. In boxing, wrestling, you have weight categories. You can have various different classifications in the way who competes against who. That classification is important to bring fair play, which is the equals are competing against more or less equals to make the competition interesting. Now, historically, women didn't play sport at all. Then women were brought into sport. It essentially became a state where women's sport was automatically treated, just from a historical context, as separate from male sport. Right? They played in different competitions. It became a basis of classification. Now, what is the basis of that classification? Some is historical. What is the basis of classification in sports where physical strength is not relevant? Is there a basis of classification? Anyone want to discuss? Should we have, and in fact, there are today, a women's world championship for chess and a men's world championship, or rather an open category. Should you have a separate women's category for chess? And what does it mean? And what does it mean for a wider world? Anyone want to take that up? Why do you think men and women's sport is segregated in the first case?
So can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, for example, if we talk about sports, and there are classifications of sport, some sports that require, suppose, physical strength a lot, there are biological reasons as to why there should be classifications differently for women and men, because you need, for any sports, you need to kind of have participants on an equal footing, which is why, as you said, there are different weight classifications, even in boxing. But when you talk about a sports like chess, where you don't necessarily need a lot of physical strength and it's based off of your intellectual capacity, uh, classifications don't make a lot of sense. But again, uh, the reason as to why I think there are different classifications, gender classifications, is again to encourage more women to get into those sports. Because when you come, like when you have had women who have not had historically access to get into these competitions like chess, there needs to be separate emphasis and focus given on a particular gender, because you need to create an equal footing before there is no differentiation. That's what I think.
Okay. So someone else wanted to make a point. I saw some other hand up.
Sir, there's one participant, Bipasha. She had
Yeah.
raised.
Go ahead, please.
Good evening, sir. So basically, what I feel is the social context in which, let's say, the women or the men are treated is like quite different. I mean, if a woman wants to take up a sport as a career, not as a hobby, I want to make that distinction. So if a woman wants to take up sport as a career, so I mean, probably she has to face like millions of questions more than a man would have to face. So I'm just like giving a random example. Let's say we don't have any category as such in, let's say, a sport like chess, and we have certain women participating and men participating. So if we see that, like men have already had quite a few privileges in the sense of, let's say, they were encouraged into the sport earlier, or they have had more opportunities to practice or things like that. So in that case, if we are not classifying on the basis of gender, so the social context in which women exist, that actually makes them very difficult to come forward, and there is sort of the invisible glass ceiling makes it very difficult for them to succeed. So I think classification, at least at this point of time, is necessary.
Okay, it's necessary, but what is the message it is sending back? So sport also, one is the classification to make it fair play. What is the signaling back to society when you are having a classification of this nature? So I understand there's structural inequality, right? You're starting off with structural inequality, which means that people will have challenges meeting the same standard. What happens when you actually have that classification? Yeah, Bipasha?
Yes, sir. So what I think is, when we are having such a classification, it may send a signal that the, let's say, not the characteristic, or let's say the intellectual capacity of men and women are different, and it may send a message like that. I'm not sure.
Yeah, so that there is in some sense, a class system. There's one which is the real chess, and the other which is women's chess. We talk about the national team. You have the Indian team, and then you have the Indian women's team, right? So it's a hyphenated existence. It will live. Now, there's some very interesting statistics. So you also have rankings are open. The best, highest ranked woman in the open rankings is currently ranked at 89th. In the past, there have been one or two women who have broken into the top 10, but there are very few exceptions. The current women's world champion is ranked, I think, 404 in the world. So that is the current state of play in women's chess. Now, is that something, let's say you flipped it and made it open category for everything, would it make this better or would it make it worse? So what happens when you have a sort of a graded system? What are the type of resources? How hard does someone have to work to compete? And what are the type of resources they will receive in order to go down that path? Anyone?
So, as long as the question is how much you can incentivize people to approach a game, I feel like when there are separate classifications for women, even in tournaments, it does act as an incentive to the extent that, because we have to see this from a sociological perspective as well, because a lot of women, even now in India, don't have access, and because the age of internet has given a lot of people access to, suppose, chess.com. We I think that still, because of that historical deficit, there needs to be special emphasis, and these tournaments do act as an incentive. Just like you said, there are, even in elite female players, there are not a lot of people who in open category who break, and I think that's one of the reasons is the small sample size of female players in chess. But if we do kind of like vitiate these classifications and tournaments, it kind of takes away the incentives of like state governments to suppose say that, oh, we don't have like we have a female chess world champion, but if you take away that tournament, there is no incentive. Then I think that's one of the major issues.
Yeah, so essentially you're creating a structure where you don't have to provide the same resources for someone to train, right? Because they're competing at a slightly different level. So you don't have to provide the same amount of backing. Now, there's even an argument that has been put out. What is the physiological difference between men and women? So just at a very basic level, it's this amount of testosterone, which leads to different level of strength in the body, muscular strength and structural strength. Now, that's very obvious in a game like boxing, swimming, wrestling. The physicality and particularly the upper body strength is quite apparent. Now, some have argued that testosterone also builds the level of aggression and the desire to win. Right? So it's not just a physical thing, but it's also a psychological thing. Now, is that science or is that stereotype? What do you think? So we're talking here no longer about physical aptitude, but do physiological and hormonal differences lead you to different capabilities on things where chess is an aggressive game as much as it's a very, you could call it a sedentary game, but the desire to work hard and desire to win, is testosterone going to give you a better chance?
Sir, Bipasha has raised her hand.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I personally think it's a stereotype because like it's a product of social conditioning basically, because it's kind of a justification which can be given to say that okay, like men have more testosterone and hence they are more aggressive and the desire to win, but it can also be looked at in a manner that okay, maybe they are conditioned to be more aggressive. So I personally think it's more of a stereotype rather than science.
Yeah, so there's actually a research study where they forced people to play online, not knowing the gender of the other person. So you're competing against genderless. You're just playing against players. You're not looking at them. There's no name. There's no signal or indicator. When it was chess was genderless, women performed exactly as well as men. The minute you switched on video or you switched on gender, women lost more regularly to men, ceding psychological advantage simply because of the gender that they saw across the table. What do you think this tells us about sort of gender imbalance? So what is leading to this? It's not, you can argue here now that this is not aptitude. There is a stereotype. And that stereotype is actually feeding into results, right? You're competing against a man. And because he's a man, you're already ceding advantage. Like, I mean, one of the research articles says it's almost like always giving the man white to start with, even if he doesn't have white. So what is doing this? Why is it possible that these results are showing these results? Bipasha, go ahead.
So I personally think that since we are also a part of the society, so we have also internalized the patriarchal ideals which are sort of fed to us, which are, I mean, the way we are conditioned, and that is kind of playing in someone's mind when a person is playing chess or rather any other sport. For example, if I'm playing, let's say in a genderless setting, so that added pressure is not there. But the fact that like if I have internalized those ideas and when I see that okay, I'm going against a man, so several factors will be in my mind that okay, like this person has had more privilege or whatever it is, so and that kind of will adversely affect my performance, because one's mental state is quite important in a game, in a competitive setting as well. So I think.
Yeah, so what does it also teach us about other forms of signaling? You're essentially seeing gender as one of the signals. How much of competition is actually based off visual and imagery signaling of the other person's opportunities, privilege? What if someone turns up in a suit, the other person turns up in not particularly good clothing, are they already at a disadvantage? The belief that the other person has had more opportunities. So gender is signaling. Is anything else signaling? Yeah, I think that's a bit of a rhetorical question. But now think about, so we've looked at this in the sports context. There's lots going on here. There are structural issues. There's certainly physiological changes. Do they play out in a sport which is arguably a mental game where the physicality doesn't play out in the game itself? You're just moving a few pieces. Now, being stronger, more stamina might play some role, but is it a determining role or not? It's possible that it isn't, but yet results show that there's exclusion and there's, in fact, unequal results that emerge from this. What does this mean at a broader social level? What other contexts? What are the skills that chess requires? What are base skills? Any of you watched any recent documentaries on chess, or rather, Netflix series? Anyone? Queen's Gambit? Anyone? Yeah, some of you might have. But what does it take to win at chess? What are the skills a man or woman or anyone might need?
So Samvida has raised.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I can see the hands now.
So I think in chess, particularly, especially when we're playing competitive chess with a timer, along with your intellectual capacity, something that you might need is agility, because you continuously need to like stop the timer and then think of the other move before your opponent makes the move, so that you can conserve your time. So I think in that there is a particular aspect of physical strength that's required as well, which can be construed to mean that chess as a sport, when played competitively in a setting which requires time, like for example, there are rapid chess tournaments right now, which are uh, 10 minutes, where you get increments of 5 seconds by the end of your first minute. So I think in that, your physical strength to some extent is required.
Yeah, so again, there's a very interesting article a year or two ago, which you can easily find on the internet, which talked about, you know, how when you have a computer and it processes the whole day, it heats up. Similarly, it seems like humans are like that too. So chess people playing at the very, very highest level were losing 6,000 calories a day when they were playing high intensity chess. So there was a serious amount of sort of processing involved, even though they were sitting in one place. It's a very, very interesting article. I might be a little bit off with that number, but it showed as much physicality as many, many other high performance sports. So the reality is there is some of that element. But let's pull this out of the sports context. What about women in science? Are there any stereotypes, women in science? So chess is probability, chess is strategy, chess is mathematics. What are the stereotypes of women in science? And what signals do you think having a separate women's championship what is the social signal it sends outwards to non-sports contexts? Yeah. Anirudh? Yeah.
Yes, so there have been studies that enrollment of women in STEM subjects has been lower for quite a long time compared to men. But at the same time, another peculiar finding in this has been that in countries which have less of gender bias, let's say the Scandinavian countries, there the difference between men and women in STEM enrollment has been even higher.
So sorry, where there's gender balance in terms of numbers or treatment?
In terms of treatment, there is less of gender bias in Scandinavian countries, but the enrollment of women in STEM as compared to men is the gap is even higher.
So
that's a paradoxical finding.
So the theory is that there are aptitudes, and certain technical or scientific aptitudes are more in favor of one gender than the other.
I'm not aware of the inference that has been drawn from this finding, but there have been empirical findings, and I cannot testify to the inferences that have been drawn from them.
Yeah. So let's say you accept separate women's chess championship, right? What is the broad signal you're sending to young girls, to people who are assessing future careers? And do you want to continue that discussion?
Yeah. So the signal is obviously negative. If you have separate championships, then there is a sociological message that goes about that women will be expected to play separate championships from men, and therefore that is the way they need to prepare also.
And that this also feeds into non-sporting context, right? So in
Yes,
many
it
ways,
does.
sport is the first place where you encounter this. As a young person, you're playing, you're being segregated very, very early on, right? And I think a very interesting thing to think about sports and sports law, is something I do. All your notions, and I can guarantee you without exception, all your notions of what was justice were first dealt with on the playground. So all of you played, may not be playground, but certainly playing, sharing things that you believed were yours, concepts of ownership, concepts of making your own rules and someone breaking them. Really, for many of us, our first brush with the law and rules and concepts of justice, which you don't have to go back to any Magna Carta or anyone to tell you what is fairness and what is right and wrong. There's an inherence which comes from play, right? So that notion and your relationship with play is your first brush with justice, your first brush with rules. In fact, many of the games you play are made up games, you making the rules. So you're legislating, you're building a world for yourself, you're breaking it down, rebuilding it, making modifications. So in many ways, it's your first brush with legislation, your first brush with justice delivery, standing up for your rights, and you're constantly playing. But at some point, you stop playing. And that somehow breaks that notion of the inherence of what is just, what is unjust. But what you're taking from sport and the signals you're receiving, whether you're playing chess or not, you are taking signals from this. So whether you're a chess player, whether you care about sport or not, you are actually part of the messaging that the sports world is sending you. So to that extent, my belief is that everyone is affected by the decisions made in sports governance. Some people know it, and some people don't know it yet. So hopefully, by the end of this, you will be on the sort of the first bucket. But think of another sport. Think of tennis. What's the difference between Grand Slams, men's and women's tennis? So just basic structure, right? How many sets do you play in a women's tennis match versus men's? Anyone? Nishan? Yeah?
Good evening, sir. The number of sets that they play are not same. Actually, the women's Grand Slams have few amounts of sets as compared to men. But being the case, like tennis is the only sport from where we can learn as to how to curb this disparity, given the fact that Wimbledon has an equal pay status to both its winners, which is not the case for many sports. So.
Yeah, it started dealing with the equal. The Grand Slams have started among the first to deal with the equal pay issue. But we talked about the mental sort of inequality. Let's talk a little bit about what you expect from men's tennis and women's tennis. So I don't know if you want to type it in the chat, but when I talk about men's tennis and the people who do really well at men's tennis, what are the adjectives that come to mind? Type it in the chat. Think of a Nadal, think of a Djokovic. What are the adjectives you think of when you think of men's tennis? Feel free to type it in the box. So agile, aggressive, these are the words. Now, what are the adjectives you would use? Think of women's tennis. Think of the women's tennis final. Nishant, we can type it in. We can join the discussion after. So what are the adjectives used for women's tennis? Anyone else? So typically you will see graceful, stylish, touch play, and the men is stamina, strength, aggression. Right? It's the same sport. But we as sort of consumers have created completely different worlds and meaning to those two sports. You've also chosen that one plays 5 sets best of 5 and the other plays best of 3. Is there science and logic to this? It's not like men are playing against women and there's inequality, right? It's women playing against women. So why do you play to different standards? Anyone want to discuss why? Saurabh? Yeah.
Yeah, good evening, sir. I think what we need to understand when we are talking about the segregation, because as we are seeing that there are two different paradigms, right? One is the men's tennis and another is the female tennis, right? But however, as the like a sporting authorities are making this as something as men versus women, while like men are more capable and more structured in a way to play tennis due to their inherent physical strengths, and on the other hand women are not capable as a whole due to their own physical strength. So it's like enforced from the sporting authorities to make it seem like a men versus women and not women versus women or men versus men, to maintain a parity in both the to maintain a parity in both the paradigms as a whole.
So even the point is the architecture of the sport, which is 3 sets instead of 5. You're saying we don't want to test how much stamina you have. You just play gracefully. Within 3 sets, you try and finish it and give us a stylish and graceful winner, right? So we're going to test completely different things. It's signaling. Why can't a woman play 5 sets? And if you're telling her that she doesn't need to play 5 sets, she's going to train to try and play best of 3, right? So
Yeah, of course.
the architecture of the sport itself is signaling to people what is worth doing and what you want out of them. And then you get a Serena Williams who comes out and plays aggressively, plays with stamina, plays with strength. And she's almost an outcast in the style, the demand that you're seeking from women's sport, right? So many people are uncomfortable. They call her sort of masculine. Why is that masculine? That's a tennis player playing tennis, and playing tennis to the demands of tennis may not meet your sort of aesthetic requirements of what you're looking at from the women's game. Women sweats and pouring sweat, that's not very nice to look at. But a man is sweating and he's just so, it's amazing how much he's putting into his game. So structurally, the architecture of these sports can also make significant differences. And when you look at gender, there's an even bigger debate, which many of you may or may not have engaged with, is one of the few places is sport where the binary is so strong that it has to be addressed, right? So are you male, are you female? Very few other places in society force you to make that binary decision. Right? There might be some places in terms of you have a woman judge versus a male judge, but no one's actually saying there's this many set aside from, and you have to prove your maleness or femaleness. But with sport, very, very front on, because sport is full of the outliers who are pushing the boundaries, right? So, for example, this Olympics coming up next month has a New Zealand weightlifter who is a trans athlete. So was originally male and is now going to compete in the female category after having satisfied all of the requirements that the International Olympic Committee has provided. So reducing testosterone level for multiple years has maintained lower testosterone level. But but they have been a male for 30 years of their life. They've lived that life. They've built that structure and physicality. Hugely controversial issue in American sport. Should trans individuals be able to choose which gender they play under, right? Sex being different from gender. Now, sport forces you to confront this in a way very, very little else does. And that is, in some sense, people who are transitioning. The even more significant issue is natural levels of testosterone. Some of you may have heard of the Duti Chand case. You might have heard of the Caster Semenya case. Essentially drawing lines on how much testosterone is male and how much, not really, that's a misframing of it, but below what testosterone level are you allowed to compete in the female category. And the reality is today, the Duti Chand, with whatever testosterone levels she has, can compete in the 100 meters and 200 meters, but on the same day cannot compete in the 400 meters. Right? So the logic of that is they're attempting to prove through science that the difference in testosterone level makes a difference at longer races rather than shorter races. They've not been able to prove. But she had to go to the Court of Arbitration for Sport and win a case for the right to compete. And hopefully she'll be at the Olympics. I think she's on the cusp of qualification. Caster Semenya case. I don't think she's going to be able to compete because CAS has held that the rules were required and proportionate. So these are not people who are trying to cheat. This is the way they were born, perhaps with different genital structures and different levels of testosterone. So sport is choosing certain values, right? It's choosing that we want to maintain the binary, and the fairness to people who are obviously in that category is more important than the inclusion of everyone. Right? So they're essentially saying that it's more important to maintain the binary than include people based on their own choices in some senses. Samvit, you have a question?
Yeah, so I had a question relating to trans inclusion in sports,
Yeah.
and I don't want to be offensive to anyone, but if, for example, in a scenario where there is a trans man who has had hormone therapy for their conversion, at what point does the council say that this is okay, but if a cis man does doping to get more testosterone, that's not okay because they are not trans? Do you think then it becomes unfair to other individuals who are participating in their own sport, or is it justified on the basis that they are trying to convert by having testosterone?
So I didn't get you. The person is transitioning from female to male.
Yeah.
And then your point is that they are taking hormone therapy, and then someone who's originally male can't take testosterone because they're breaching WADA guidelines.
Yeah.
So the reality is no one is competing in the transition from female to male is not the one in dispute. Because again, what we discussed before, the male category is seen as higher value, right? So much more difficult to compete in. The challenge is in the other way around, where someone who has been male wants to compete in the female category, which is seen as less competitive. So I get the point you're trying to make, but the reality is no one is trying to transition from female to male. It is not, I mean, they might transition and want to compete in that, but that is not a choice that is favorable. So you're not choosing it because, I mean, no one is choosing it just to win, but it isn't that you're gaining any significant advantage. Now, you may have gone through hormone therapy is what you're suggesting, right? And that it improves your performance, but you're improving off a base from a sort of female category to male. And there's still going to be tolerance limits for men of having unnatural elements of testosterone. I don't know if that answers your question adequately.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So I think the important point to know is many of these disputes, and they are disputes, are being front-ended by sport. They have huge amounts of fallout on society at large, your perception of gender, perception of fairness, what is right and what is wrong. It could be women in science, it could be physicality, the ability to do certain jobs, the broader glass ceiling itself. In your own professions, does a woman have the aggression and drive to be a law firm partner? Do they have what it takes to go through all of the drive that is necessary, the politics, the competition, or are they always just going to be the executors, not leaders? Big social question, right? Very often fought on the sports field, you are getting the reflection of the signaling whether you know it or not, right? So I think we can talk about gender. Second, you had a few people interested in intellectual property. Let's talk a little bit about intellectual property, something that I'm quite interested in. Are we aware, just in terms of what happens on a sports field, right? So let's say, what's the famous way of doing the high jump, which transformed the way that high jump is done? Anyone familiar with the technique of high jump? Nishan?
So is it the Dick Frosby technique?
Yeah, so it's the Fosbury flop, right? So before Fosbury came up with this, which is essentially the way you see people doing the high jump, everyone went with head and face down. So he was the first to go backwards with the head in the air and eyes looking up. That transformed the world of high jumping, and it's never been the same. So in terms of the records, everything went much, much higher. Now, what would happen, and the laws do not permit it, he did apply but did not get any protection, intellectual property protection, for the way of high jumping. And in many ways, sport is immune from this. You cannot get patent protection, copyright protection for an innovative way to play sport, a sports move, right? Why do you think that's the case? Why is the sports field immune from intellectual property? Krishna?
Sir, I think that since it involves a matter of skill, so anyone who learns that might also employ in his game. That's why.
So it requires skill, and it requires people to employ skills that are already known. Is that what your point is?
So, for example, someone like if we come to cricket, for example, the helicopter shot.
Yeah.
Like Dhoni started playing it, but after that, 2-3 players, others started trying it also.
Emulation. So people are emulating it. What would happen if you gave Dhoni patent protection in playing?
Yes, sir. That's what I'm saying. That.
Yeah. So helicopter shot. Let's say Dhoni got a patent. What would it? How would you play it out in the sports field? What would Surya Kumar Yadav, who wants to play helicopter shot, what does he have to do before playing the shot?
Like he has to practice for that shot. It's not like you can play that shot on every type of ball. The ball has to be a full length, and then there is a certain technique involved while playing that shot. So if we put a patent or something like intellectual property rights over it, then will the other players be able to play it as freely as they do?
Yeah, so he would have to essentially go and get a license from Dhoni, right, before playing it. Does he have the time to do that between the bowler bowling and him deciding he has to play this? No, right?
No, not at all, sir.
Yeah, so essentially you're building a system that is immune, and there are essentially, why is Dhoni doing this? What has motivated him to build this new shot? Or Dilshan to play Dil Scoop, or someone Ranji to play the leg lance. What has motivated them?
I think their own way of playing that game.
Yeah, but what are the results that they're seeking? I think Rishabh, to perform better, they're figuring out new ways to play the game that are going to get them results. What do the results get them? Arya?
So I just felt that maybe if you provide a patent to someone, especially in in the case of high jump, then we know that he is going to use that technique and no one else can, and then he is always going to win that particular sport and no one else can compete with him. And I think sports to an extent is about competition, and people want to see that competition. So if you remove that competition, then there's a big aspect of people watching that particular sport going away from it.
So competition, uncertainty, and also emulation, right? With sport, you're constantly building on the previous person's work. Now, if you started taking the building blocks away from commerce, you would struggle, right? Because you're essentially, it's a license-based system where you have to get licenses from 6 people to improve the next stroke, because someone else has decided you should put the right foot out before the left foot and play the switch hit. And then the way of holding the bat. So imagine if you had to go and get a patent portfolio, licenses to a whole portfolio before playing a stroke. Sport is about constantly iterative improvement and not waiting in some sense 20 years of a life of a patent before trying to improve the way someone else has figured out how to do it, right? Anirudh?
Another thing which I thought of would be a reason why we do not have intellectual property is when we are playing a particular kind of shot or we are employing a particular technique in sport. It's it's usually more impulsive than an act of intellect.
Hmm.
So when Dhoni would have first tried the helicopter shot, he would not have come up with an idea through a lot of intellectual process in his mind. It would have been more impulsive on his part, and that would be true for all other shots that we usually play. So sports itself is an evolutionary thing
Hmm.
which people did for their enjoyment or for their pleasure, and it eventually evolved that way that we are now playing it as a competition. So sports itself is not something which is an intellectual which can qualify as an intellectual activity.
That is a big question. Not sure I would totally agree. It's certainly the product of both. I don't know if you want to call it intellectual, but there's certainly the brain in play, and there's coordination. There's the ability to come up with something new in the context. But I get your point that it's the product of practice and it emerges from the body. But many would argue so does innovation, so does authorship. Things that you're creating are just emerging, right? So someone else wanted to say something? Sorry. Yeah. What, in some sense, how many of you have studied intellectual property? Is that a subject? Any of you finished or not? No? What is the theory? Why do we have intellectual property? Why do we have copyright law? Why do we have patent law? Anyone? Anirudh?
It is to grant protection to the author or the creator, so that they are incentivized to create more of intellectual work.
So essentially, it's saying that. What is it saying that if this incentive did not exist, what would happen?
There would be lesser of creation because you cannot commercially exploit your work.
Less invention, less desire to write creative things, to make movies, to right. So this is a historical 200 to 300 years we've had of the copyright and patent systems. It is premised on the belief that in order to incentivize creativity and innovation, the state has to give exclusivity. So the ability to commercialize it is handed over to the creator, without which people would not create. Now that argument has been roundly criticized over many years as well, even at the time when this was granted through letters patent and various sort of historic ways. The argument is that there are people who are intrinsically sort of desirous of expressing themselves and will write, will create. And the human tendency, I think, in the way that if it was Anirudh who talked about, it just emerges, right? It's a part of being human. And in many ways, you do not necessarily need these extrinsic motivators, or at least extrinsic legal motivators, to put it out into the public domain. There might be patronage, there might be reward systems which do not need exclusivity. There could be just social value in authorship, right? Just respecting someone, that the idea emerged from that person. Now put these two together, and what is sport telling us? What is sport telling us that, what can it teach intellectual property policy? Anirudh?
So one of the major critiques of the idea of intellectual property is that instead of increasing competition, it limits competition in the marketplace. So once you grant exclusive right to a particular company or to a particular author, you are limiting competition in the marketplace. But the idea of sport is to have as much competition as possible. So if you start granting intellectual property in sport, then competition will be.
So the argument is that it slows down innovation, because for 20 years, no one can try and improve that thing, because the person continues to retain the right to even improvements and derivatives and changes, right? So you're essentially increasing the innovation cycle, or the ability to, when it comes down to content industries, the ability to remix, to build on and to change. What is sport telling you? that you build enough motivations which are not necessarily based on exclusivity. People will still do these things because they want to be recognized, they want to be socially recognized, they want to be compensated. And the reality is, yes, the sports industry depends on intellectual property. So athletes are getting paid through broadcast rights, through sponsorships, which depend on copyright system, broadcast rights system, broadcast reproduction rights, and trademarks and other things like that, sponsorships. But the reality is these were not significant motivators. And over the last 150 years, through the whole Olympic movement, through the 20th century, people have constantly improved, right? Even without financial compensation that is a derivative of the intellectual property system. The reality is people, if they're adequately motivated and incentivized without exclusivities, will continue to innovate, improve, and to change the status quo, right? There are intrinsic motivators that people want to get better just for the sake of getting better. They want to express themselves because they want to be better. So what can we learn from that and take to intellectual property? Does it need us to, in some sense, the evidence that is there in sport and the ability to continue to improve, remix, innovate? Should we be looking at other industries that are so driven by intellectual property? Pharmaceuticals being a very topical one. Content industry, right? What can we learn from sport in these regards? Why do people put up YouTube videos? Want to be famous, right? May not necessarily want to make money. There could be completely different motivators to build a profile which you'll figure out how to commercialize without copyright. The many creators who do not want their content to be exclusive, but automatically it falls into copyright territory, whether you like it or not. So the default is copyright. May not be the case with patent. And the whole Creative Commons movement has been to try and change the defaults, that authors can put it back into the public domain at the point of creation itself. So what can we learn from sport in this sense? That humans want to improve, you give them enough motivations. You do not necessarily need the exclusivity as the motivator or the incentive, right? Sports people are fighting at the front lines. Very different battles for what we're capable of as human beings, to show us the extent of our capacities, both mental, physical, psychological. And they're fighting those battles without being given exclusivities. Now, as humans, will we be willing to fight the same battles in other spheres without copyright exclusivities, trademark exclusivities? What would the public domain look like if you did not have patents and copyrights? Would there be less innovation? Would there be less creativity? Anyone? Discussion group. It's time to discuss. Anirudh.
I don't think so. In fact, in recent time, there has been a lot of criticism of different forms of intellectual property in the field of pharmaceutical, or even with respect to copyright on literary works, as you have LibGen, Sahib, and all these websites coming up. So there has been a lot of challenge to the argument that granting intellectual property incentivizes people to create more, and there have been arguments coming up from the other side in recent time. So I think this idea, even the idea of sport, that you should not have intellectual property, if we bring into other spheres of commercial life, then it can lead to even better innovation, and as more competition comes up, there can be more innovation and more creativity can be seen. That is what I think.
Yeah, so there's a lot of theory around this which says that sports, and there's a concept called specificity, which is sports is specific, it's different, it deserves separate legal treatment, and lots of exceptions are given for sport because of its special role in sort of international life and social life. Now the question is, if it's specific, is it also capable of being ported? So is there portability of the principles that emerge from sport? Can you put them into other contexts, like the ones we talked about, pharmaceuticals? Or is sport so different that what happens in sport stays in sport, just like what happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas? What do you think? Can we learn? Is it so unique and specific, or is it just humans being humans? And whether they're playing sport or painting or writing poems or books, it's all the same things. It's just different ways of being human. So is it right to say sport is sport and we're not going to export norms and export legal principles from it to other spheres? Or do we learn from sport? Any jurisprudential theory here? Anyone want to add anything? Okay. So third thing we talked about a little bit is technology law and data protection. How many people are interested in what's happening in data protection? Yeah, so some interest in data protection, what's happening with consent frameworks, what can you take? So where is it already happening without any sort of laws? I mean, it's happening all over the place, but one of the places it's happening without real reflection is in sport. Is the performance data of athletes, the physiological data. In places like China, they're testing genetic data to determine whether they want to fund an athlete. To see, look within the genes to see, does this person have the capability to be a gymnast, to be a swimmer? So going much deeper, and in many ways, the sports body is probably going to know more about you than you know about yourself as an athlete. So what are the bounds and what are the norms? So in many cases, there are no laws, there are no norms. In other places, you have things like the GDPR, you have consent frameworks. Now, what you do have in sport is very much a take it or leave it model. It's not that athletes are negotiating their way and saying, okay, you can take this much of my data, you can't. You are essentially signing up to participation terms of events, participation terms of teams, pretty much a standard form contract. You know how standard form contracts work. And they are not negotiating how much data, what it can be used, how it can be used. The regulations of sport are already putting that in play. And for example, in the most recent iteration of the WADA code, which is the anti-doping code, they have held that the blood tests which are taken, which is compulsory, right? You can't refuse a blood test for anti-doping testing. Today can be, without the consent of the athlete, also used for eligibility testing. What is eligibility testing? To determine whether someone can participate in the female category. Right? So the question is, in the norms, what would this be? Essentially portability of content, right? Modularity of consent would mean that if I've given it for anti-doping, it should stay with anti-doping. You cannot use my testing data to determine male, female, testosterone, and other things without my specific consent. But GDPR, other frameworks, so essentially you have a framework where even if things are done with your consent, how much is collected, it is done within a monopolistic framework where either you give your consent or you have to sit out, you cannot participate. So it's a precondition and a fixed condition for participation. Or else it comes through the legitimate interest test, that the sports body has a legitimate interest under GDPR, even if consent is not given, that certain types of data can be collected and processed for legitimate interest. Now the question is, this is going to be transport to all of us, not just sports people, because this is the way states are going to deal with and already dealing with essential services, right? You already see that with things like rations and getting essentially any type of subsidy. The amount of data you have to give today includes an Aadhaar card, which includes biometric information. What are we going to learn from sport and the battles being fought in sport in our everyday lives, our dealing with technology, dealing with a state who's going to offer us these binary options? Either give me your data and enjoy the benefits of being a citizen or state, or you sit out, right? How do we negotiate these frameworks? And in many ways, athletes are caught in this either play or don't play, and are also caught in the inability to negotiate individually. We also, for example, in our country have very few collective bargaining positions where there are player unions, where people will argue on behalf of collectives, very little player associations. I think football has it, cricket now has it for retired players only. But essentially the individual athlete, very almost impossible to fight a lone bargain, right? Someone is bearing all the cost of fighting this battle at the cost of getting excluded, where many other people benefit. So essentially, collective action problem. No one individual has the ability to fight this battle because it costs them too much, both financially and from the perspective of power and exclusion. So how are you going to fight these battles in sport? What are the appropriate norms? So for example, in the NBA has a players association. This is basketball in the US, which strongly pushes back on the norms of what can be collected, how much can be collected, and how much can be used. They have very specifically nominated only 3 types of wearables. Wearables are things like watches, things that people put on. It could be inserted in clothing. And they have limited it to 3 specific scientifically tested wearables, which can be only used during training. So you cannot even put this wearable on the basketball athlete when they're playing a match. So building normative frameworks on what is possible, what is not. Why is this important? Why is it important for norms and lines to be drawn? Aryan?
Sir, I had a question regarding the collection of performance data. So, so particularly when there are third parties that are also getting access to this data in terms of betting companies, if like, for the example of Project Red Card, where players have challenged the fact that Premier League clubs are providing this data to betting companies. So how do we what's the source of regulation there as well? Because most of it is done through practices within the club and contract and agreements. So
yeah, so this is a hugely controversial issue at this point of time, which is the sharing of the pie, right? So for example, who owns the performance? And there are 2 types of performance data. There's testing data, which is intrusive. You're collecting blood tests, you're collecting samples, wearables. So things that you cannot collect without the permission of the athlete, right? You can't do a blood test without, you could force someone to do a blood test, but that would be quite regressive. But there's another element, which I think what Aryan's talking about is observable performance data. I'm checking your scores are being converted into odds are being converted into bets. Do you have a stake in it? So in many ways, again, it's like you're signing up a participation agreement, your player agreement with a team. The team is signing up to be part of the event. The event organizer essentially is claiming an assignment of all these rights. Now, what the player unions are coming back and saying is this is revenue being made off our performances of players. And that's what Project Red Card is saying. Essentially, these are generated products of our labor. Where's that similarly happened? With music copyright, right? So different participants in the music copyright system, songwriters, lyricists. Anyone familiar with the battle there? Anyone familiar with recent changes in copyright law in music? So essentially, this is the ability to assign your rights. So songwriters, lyricists, other people, historically were just brought in, assigned all their rights, and the production house got all rights for secondary and further uses. So essentially what they did it was for the film, right? But now this film is being played at an award show. It's being played at an IPL match. It's being played on radio. The original purpose of the assignment was for the film, to show it as part of the Bollywood film. So what Parliament vendor did is change the bargaining power, saying it is impossible to assign this and make a full assignment. You're only getting a limited license for use within the film. If you re-commercialize this, you have to start sharing again with the lyricist and songwriter, because these are not originally intended uses. So the law came in and forced a bargain, saying it is impossible to fully assign to the producer. So similarly, think of it in the sports context again. Go back into sport. What would this look like in Project Red Card? Aryan, what is the basic thing the person is signing up to do, the athlete?
So usually this data is collected for the maximization, like the efficiency of like the player on the pitch and to maximize their result.
To play better. It's not, not to create a new market and sell it.
Yes, sir.
And if that new market is being created, what is Project Red Card saying is we have to share in it, because we are producers in the same way that songwriters and lyricists are participants in the creation of the larger song. You may have a Sonu Nigam singing, but someone else has written the lyrics. You may have Betfair building a market and it being whatever premiership match, but the reality is the stuff you're trading off is someone's work, right? And that's the big battle that's on. It'll be very interesting to see where that ends up. But I mean, these were 3 examples I wanted to bring to you here. Saurabh?
So I had a question regarding this performance data only.
Yeah.
So it usually happens that whenever a star player of any particular team gets injured, like the fans are very anxious, right? That what happened to the player and what's exactly the nature of the injury, right? So whether when the club shares the specific details of the injury in to the media, so that information is in public interest of the fans, or whether that should be construed as uh, like personal data completely. So what are your views on that?
Yeah, that's a great question, because medical data of athletes, what is the extent of privacy and what is the extent of responsibility? Even in sort of the European the incident, right? We don't know necessarily what happened to the player. That's clearly sort of the medical privacy has trumped over everyone else's. I need to know what actually happened on that pitch, right? So his reports are not necessarily publicized. Did he have heart failure? Did he have sort of COVID? Had he taken a vaccination? Lots of speculation, and there is possibly a public interest given how high profile the incident was of a player in a live match going down. But yet, the laws in the European Union are so strong on medical privacy that I don't think any of us know, right, what exactly happened to him. There might be a broader public interest, but that is always going to be balanced off against medical data privacy, which is extremely strong under GDPR. So you could certainly share it with the consent of the player. Without the consent, it's an arguable case.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I think these are 3 examples. Whether you're interested in sport or not, the battles being fought in sport are battles for all of us, each of us, in so many different contexts. And sports law and governance isn't exclusionary. In fact, it's among the most inclusionary things, whether you want to be a sports lawyer or not. And I really encourage people to engage with it. It is not a specialization. It is the most general area of law possible, because sports is in everything. And I mean, if you want to get into a debate, you name a subject in your 5 years of law school, I'll tell you an interesting legal issue from a sports perspective. If you want to go through that, happy to. But any of your interests, they have a position in the world of sports governance. Is it corporate governance, the way that sports institutions are structured and governed in an autonomous way without much regulation from the state? Is it constitutional law? It's the PIL jurisdiction over sports bodies, the Lodha Committee, judicial review, Article 226, multiple cases. If it's criminal law, huge debates on assumption of risk. How much risk does a player assume when playing a sport, and in particular when playing a combat sport? Does criminal law end at the touchline? Can criminal law enter the field, and in what instances? Saurabh?
So on this particular note, I have a question that, so sir, why is it that a stadium, like what happens inside the stadium, is immune from the state's criminal jurisdiction, right? Is it like we consider the stadium as high seas where like nothing happens, or like what should be the role of the sporting institutions in incorporating criminal jurisprudence into the rule books of the game? Like,
So
and
I wouldn't say the stadium is immune. It's within the touch lines. So just wanted to be clear there. So, I mean, you can certainly commit offenses within the stadium. But there's this huge debate on. So you had more to ask? Maybe you didn't finish.
Yeah. Also, on that note only, where should be the line drawn between an aggression and violence in the game? Because at max you can get a red card in football, but what happens if you just go and punch that particular person in the dugout, or what happens between the coaches, right? So on that note, if you
Yeah,
could.
so certainly it's not an immune. It's certainly not a high seas, but there is a tolerance which the law gives to sport recognizing the extreme nature of the behavior. So you're giving space to people to push the limits. And if you actually brought criminal law into the play field for unintentional acts. Now, if someone actively goes and beats someone else up on the football field, that doesn't change the applicability of criminal law. So it's not like this is a sort of a no-go zone. But the reality is sports, in most instances, so there's a whole parallel argument that sports law exists as a separate body of law, which is called lex sportiva, which is just general principles of international law as applicable to sport. Principles of fair play, principles of governance, principles of transparency, good governance principles, spirit of sport, other things which are beyond legal systems. And it asks the legal system, stay away from the play field. Now, what it generally has is that we have adequate and coherent standards within the code of sport. It's not that there's no law that applies. It's that the code of internal regulation of sport, which an autonomous sports body is implementing, has a remedy and will exercise that remedy. So just give us a little bit of deference and stay away from the play field. Now, it doesn't give that deference if there's intentionality and serious injury that causes serious physical harm. Like Paul Gascoigne goes in and kicks a fan, certainly not outside the realm of criminal responsibility. Negligence and the stadium stands fall down and hundreds of people get killed, certainly not immune from criminal responsibility. Where the real fault lines are is, let's say, a professional foul by a defender on someone who's coming to try and score a goal. So it is outside the realm of what is permissible, right? It is a foul, and there is a remedy within the sport for to person get a red card and to be banned for 3 matches, 5 matches, maybe even more than that. The question is, will you let criminal law into that transaction? Because a professional foul is intentional, right? You're trying to bring that person down. Now, is it intentionally a foul, or is it an intention to create an injury? So to permanently damage that person's, maybe could be end up in a career-threatening injury, right? Will the person have a remedy for assault in that instance? And there's mixed jurisprudence. Many will argue criminal law should still stay away, because the seriousness of the ban, where the person could be banned for a year or even a life ban, is theoretically adequate deterrence. And the consequence of allowing criminal law onto the sports field would cause much more detriment than the detriment caused to one person and the loss of one person's career, because it would make people much more hesitant to act, to play at their extremes, which is what we are actually demanding. The social role we're demanding from athletes is to push the limits and to do everything permissible within the rules of the game. And the argument is that fouls are also within the rules of the game because they're nominated as fouls, right? Now, there's no foul recognized for going and punching someone in the face in a football match. That is well outside the realm. But neighboring harm, that is just neighboring to what is permissible, but is a foul, should that be criminalized or not? I think there's a huge argument on balance that the one-off cases and the exceptions should not determine the broader rule, which could have serious implications on the way the sport is played and what we're expecting from specific players. Tushmi, you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering what your viewpoint is on mediation with regards to sports law, and if it's kind of curbing the data protection aspect of it.
So data protection of mediation?
No, I was wondering if
okay,
it's kind of connected. Like, is data being protected by encouraging more mediation in sports law?
Yeah, so I mean, it's heavily underutilized. It's been used by a few sports bodies in terms of mediation and even resolution of disputes in sort of friendly manners, and hugely relevant to sport because of the nature of sport itself. At the end of the dispute, these two people are forced to interact with each other again. So it's not like there are other places to go, right? So sport is all organized under one pyramid. There's only one federation you can play for in India. There's only one federation you can go up and play for if you're playing football in the world, right? So the relevance of dispute resolution is significant, and the ability to find alternative manners which are still reasonably cost efficient and are oriented towards the people finding win-win situations where they engage again is hugely important in sport, but seriously undervalued. There's very little that we've seen in the mediation and sports world. Most of them are treated as sort of adversarial proceedings where there is one winner, there's one loser, and very often, even if you win, you'll be shadow banned from that federation because you've taken on the powers that be. There are just structural issues with trying to find resolutions, right? We look at even the Caster Semenya, how far she's gone, and now she started playing some other sport even. So she's been excluded from that partly because of this. And many of the rules, many would argue, have been designed specifically for her. And looking at her as the test case and wanting to exclude her. So there's a whole argument that rules should not be sort of created for specific people. They should be of general import. And the next person who comes with some other type of outlier genetic disposition, are you going to make another rule for them? Then you're not really building principles. You're just sort of addressing specific cases. To your other question on data protection, I think you are going to have to see some form of ombudsman type of body in sport, which is advocating and standing between sports bodies and sports people. And we're going to see that if the data protection bill comes in again, some arbiter between, and I think mediation is a good word to use, someone who sees both sides of the picture and is able to give the sports body what is necessary and is in the interest of the athlete and find commonality of interest. Because there's with data, there are many aligned interests, and there's huge value in the team or the sports body getting this, giving it to the athlete, working with the athlete, fixing deficiencies, fixing technical flaws, improving technique. But there are also significant divergences. The person may leave this team and then go and play in another team. They may be playing for Delhi Capitals, they move to Mumbai Indians. Now, Delhi Capitals still holds 5 years worth of their data. Is Delhi Capitals allowed to use it now against them? Can it use all of the invasive data? So it knows how the heartbeat data during the person batting in the nets. They know that when a left arm fast bowler comes, the heart rate goes up because the person is nervous. Now, can they use that and make sure that a left arm bowler is bowling to this person when they move to an opposing team? So there's going to be also divergences. And I don't think a data protection bill will address industry by industry and say, here are the principles for sport, but you're going to have to find balanced industry standards, and so perhaps an ombuds person, whatever that person might play a role, understanding both sides. And I think it's a good suggestion to think of it from a mediation perspective of trying to find that commonality, but also respecting that people might have divergent interests with respect to data, and helping to find that commonality of ground. And I think the judiciary will also start playing a role in nominating principles and where you can go and where you can't go with consent and with legitimate interest. Any other question, Arya?
Yes, sir, I had a question. I wanted your opinion on places where there is a lack of regulation. For example, esports, something which has been recognized by the Asian Games as a medal game, but we still don't have a nationally recognized federation for that, and we have private bodies that are managing those sports. And even at an international level, we don't have that something like a FIFA or something like an IOC which handles these things. So how do you manage those areas?
Yeah, so it's a very sort of cutting edge issue that's ongoing in sport discussions on multiple fronts. So one is its appropriateness within the Olympic movement itself. Why might that be an issue? Arya, why do you think there's a problem of appropriateness? What is the Olympic IOC's hesitation? What could be the hesitations with esports?
So I think maybe it's about the not being physical, maybe.
So less so. I mean, there's an element of that. What are the typical types of esports that are popular?
It's mostly related to gaming, like
What type of games are the
So there's like first person shooting games, or say FIFA, things
almost
like that.
many of them are shooting games, right?
Yeah.
So the issue is Olympism at a broad level is not in favor of violence. So the principle of does it fit within the Olympic movement? One, from a perspective of violence. Two, this is all publisher driven, right? You don't have really a federation structure like we talked about internationally or anywhere else. The platform that is being created is a private platform created by a software company which is known as a publisher. Many things come from that. So there might be inside information, is there transparency, that publisher belongs to one country, is there going to be more favorable data? There are going to have to be much more checks on the platform. So the advantage with the natural world is everyone getting the same world. Right? With esports, do you know that the American team and the Russian team and Indian team are going to get the same sort of facilities to play with? We don't know. We don't know how technology works. It's less transparent in many ways. Also, the broader philosophical question is when you're creating this world, are you creating the possibility of a perfect game? Right? And what is the thrust of sport, other sports, non-esports? Huge thrust of it is we have not found the ends of human capability. Right? So we're constantly still on this quest to see how fast really can a person run the 100 meters. How fast can you run the marathon? Half of the meaning is in knowing that we don't know. On esports, a constructed world, there is theoretically, in many cases, I mean, you could have machine learning based games or AI based games, but there is potentially a finite world and a perfect game. Now, does that fit into the broader Olympic movement of what we're aspiring to, where if perfection is possible, how do you beat perfection? And what will people aspire to? I mean, there are other whole elements of sort of, is it something to be promoted? Does it constitute sport? Those debates are on. I think the Asian Games has brought it in as a medal event in 2022. India is looking to even recognize a federation in due course. So next month you'll hear of a federation. But it's a highly disputed thing of whether it fits into the broader role of sport. Is it a sport in itself? And some very interesting other governance issues as well. So, for example, you talked about FIFA. You talked about it's essentially football esports. Then you could have volleyball esports. Now, in the world of sports governance, will FIFA own esports version of FIFA? So when I say own, will it have the governance rights over? Or do you have a horizontal, everything electronic goes under the Electronic Sports Federation, World Electronic Sports Federation? So it's challenging new paradigms even in sports governance of who has the right to govern. Is the International Volleyball Federation going to govern e-volleyball? Right? So all of these, I think technology and science constantly are challenging sport in the same way that commerce and globalization have challenged sport, right? So the influx of money and private participation as broadcasters, sponsors have changed the whole structure in the way sport is governed, and the whole aspect of governance is now managing a market, not just about holding an event. In the same way, technology is bringing new challenges, science has brought challenges on performance, also now data collection, data processing are new challenges. So it's a constantly dynamic world. There's no fixed, this is the principle and this is where it's going to be, which also keeps it challenging, keeps it interesting, and keeps it extremely dynamic, where you have to understand the broader world of what's happening around you, but also around sport, and seeing the interfaces of commerce, of technology, social changes, perceptions within the realm of sport. So in many ways, the outside world infiltrates sport, and then sport sends out signals back to the outside world again, which is where I think we come back to why does sport matter and why should it matter to all of you? Hopefully that answered your question, Arya.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think we have a few more. Happy to answer as many questions as all of you have. Next, Anirudh.
Yes, sir. So mine is also a policy governance based question.
Sure.
So in India as in other countries, we have different associations for different sports, and there has been a view that, let's say, cricket being a more commercialized, a more private sport with less of government intervention, BCCI being a body that is free of government intervention, that is a reason for success of India in cricket. So do you think more commercialization of a sport can encourage more people to come into that sport and help the country perform better in that sport? What is your view on this?
So, I mean, it's a little bit of a chicken and egg issue. I mean, when you have the money, you can govern things better. When you don't have the money, you don't take things seriously enough. And when there's no governance, you don't also have a commercial structure that is put into play. So I think it's not accurate to say that the BCCI has got no government interference. I mean, it's historically the most politicized body that we've had in Indian sport, right? So it may not be in formal capacities, but we've had multiple people, powerful people act as presidents, act as presidents of state bodies of the BCCI itself. So it's very much interfaced with the government, may not be legally so. It has certainly built a strong market and a case for governance leading to better markets, but also more money leading to accountability. And in many ways, it was singled out by the Supreme Court as well and the Lodha Committee in a way that no other sports body was. And some of that was because it was so high profile and so interwoven in socio-culturally into life in India. And so much of that has been driven by the commerce of cricket, right? Broadcasting, sponsorship, how it comes into your home. And the Supreme Court really looked at it from a multifarious perspective, looking at conflict of interest, looking at governance. So commerce, in fact, forces you to be better governed. It isn't always government interference that is going to be your governor. It could be public faith. It could be that at the end of the day, the business model of cricket is based on public trust and faith and continued interest. That itself can be a driver of regulation and good governance. So there can be very strong commercial motives. It's not. I think we are very often mistaken in seeing law as the only regulator and state as the only point. There's also norms. There's the market is a strong regulator. There'll be members from within. There'll be sort of infighting is a regulator where there's dialectics within governance, disagreement within a sports body. So governance isn't just one thing, which is the state telling sports body what to do. There are many sort of drivers which influence governance, and some of those could be things as simple as public faith, public perception, and also just the commercial interests that come from that public perception and public brand. Hopefully that answers your question, Anil. If there's anything more.
Yes, that's it. Thank you, sir.
Okay, great. Saurabh?
Yeah, so it's often observed that the athletes complain of like anti-competitive agreements with restrictive clauses like non-compete clauses, right? So do you think that antitrust regulators have a big role to play in enforcing antitrust law in the sports paradigm? Or else like we should adhere to the specificity of sports doctrine.
Yeah,
So if you could elucidate on like what the role of CCI should be in regulating like competition law within the sports field.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Saurabh, and very much hits into things I've been thinking about for a long time, which is governance issue in sport is as much an economics governance issue. And the reality is these are not just governance monopolies, they are also economic monopolies that are being set up. And with the professionalization of sport, it would be completely ridiculous to ignore the competitive elements. The international sports law separates the roles of sports federations into the regulatory role and the economic role. What it does is it gives you deference in the regulatory role to the concept that Saurabh talked about, which is called specificity, which is sports is unique and special. And we will defer on some instances where things would generally be treated as anti-competitive, monopolistic abuse of dominant position. We will grant sports special status and we will not interfere, for example, in things like a salary cap to make sure that there's competitive balance between teams. If one team could spend $500 million and the other spend 10 million, you would have an unequal contest just structurally because of the players they could buy. So there's an interest in balanced competition. So teams being relatively similar to each other, which means a salary cap on how much you can pay a player or a full team would be accepted under competition law in the sense that it would not otherwise if this was outside sport. So a cartel behavior among Airtel, Jio and Vodafone saying that we will not pay all of us employees more than X amount, that would not satisfy the CCI regulation. But sport, we recognize this concept of specificity. Now, multiple CAS decisions and world over, you've seen the differentiation between the regulatory role and the economic role. Now, even in the economic role, there's some leeway for legitimate interests and proportional norms. But governance is as much about governance of the economic pyramid of sport as much as it is the regulatory pyramid. And I would love to see much more sort of evaluation of many of our norms. And if you see European Union sports law, so much of it is driven by the competition authorities, much less driven by states, the nation states, in bringing in basic governance norms. So in India, we have the National Sports Development Code, which is recognition and de-recognition. Most of the action is spent there at this point of time. But my belief is we have to transcend and build effective, high-quality sports across markets, the CCI has to play a much, much more active role in enabling lots of the blockages in creation of markets, sponsor participation in sports, broadcasting, the way that the business model of sport is evolved, and sort of the choke point role that sports federations play and is going to be absolutely critical. So, for example, in the EU, you cannot grant broadcast rights for more than 3 years at a time. And here we are granting 5 years, 10 years of IPL rights, BCCI rights, just fostering competition. There's one big sport, it's cricket. One broadcaster gets it, the other broadcaster is sitting out for 5 years, right? If one broadcaster gets ICC and BCCI properties, the other one has no cricket effectively of any meaning for a 5-year, 10-year period. Another one, now today, broadcast rights are even spliced. So even within a year, they have to be sold in buckets, recognizing that broadcast rights may be of different value to different people. So for example, Premiership rights, Amazon has bought many of the matches around Christmas. Very smart thing to do, right? You want to cross-sell gifting. So people are buying jerseys, buying Christmas gifts while watching the match. So broadcast rights might also be valuable and we need to be capable of being diced. May not necessarily be most valuable in a single hand as well, especially given the way technologies evolve, distribution is so much easier, the barriers to participation are so much lower. We are moving to much more. Today, there are 2 sports broadcasters in India, right? Star and Sony. Everyone else is more or less has been. And that is in many ways created by, I would say, failure to enforce strong competition standards upstream in the markets for rights, in the markets for sponsorships, markets for advertising. So a great question and certainly something to keep an eye out for. Hope that answered your question, sir.
Yes, sir, absolutely.
Okay, Samarth?
Yeah, good evening, sir. Sir, so towards the beginning of the discussion, we discussed how sports give certain signals about multiple social aspects. So I wanted to know how your foundation, when they go for the talent hunt or when there is your first intervention for grooming the athletes, how do you take care? How does the foundation basically take care of these social aspects so that the signal which we thought are problematic should not go?
Yeah, so I mean, there's social signaling can be of multiple sorts, right? It could be social, could be religious, could be so many different things. And the way we had looked at it is very different. Many similar organizations look at it from a perspective of how are we going to win medals. Now, our organization looked at it very differently, saying that there are many preconceptions sitting here in Indian sport. We believe we're good at only sports which require quick reflexes. We are not good at strength sports. We are not good at team sports. I mean, lots of preconceptions. So what we actually did actively, and you'll see that in even the types of athletes we support and the types of athletes which are going to go to the Olympics, we started off with what is called the Rahul Dravid Athlete Mentorship Program. So we worked with Rahul in conceptualizing it. And he actually laid out a challenge for us saying, think about this differently. Go to the places which have not got the support and try and see whether it's possible to create an athlete in that by providing the support. Because in many ways in the past, these are in many ways tropes which have been created after not even having tried, right? So if you give everyone a chance and then you say, okay, we're only good at shooting, I can get it. But there were preconceptions that we're good at certain things, but those were self-fulfilling prophecies because we'd only supported people who had already won in the past. So if you win, you get support, and if you get support, you'll win again. So what we did is we've taken a very counterintuitive view. So you'll see even at this Olympics, one of the people who's qualified is, her name is Bhavani Devi. She's a fencer. So the first woman fencer ever from India to go. And she's been supported for over 8 or 10 years. And without support, she was sort of looking to quit. Very good articles in the last couple of days on her. She's even appeared in a RIN ad. So counterintuitive, saying that let's go and prove that one is possible, and if one is possible, maybe the next 10 will happen automatically, right? We are not a federation where we don't have the power over sort of the whole ecosystem. But what we have the power over is going and making that one change and one single proof of concept. The previous Olympics, the person we had supported is Deepa Karmakar, who I'm sure you're familiar with in gymnastics. Again, someone who had not got the support. So we looked alternate sports, many more women in sport. Also, we are the first foundation to start working with Paralympians. So we support about 50 or 60 Paralympians. And there the signaling is much, much beyond sport. It's about perception of disability, what is disability, perception of opportunities, perception of self. And there we have seen the impact of our program much wider than sport. It's really transformed the whole disability rights movement as well. Today, Paralympians stand shoulder to shoulder. They are entitled to the Khel Ratna, entitled to the Arjuna Award. These were not necessarily givens at that point of time. Equal rewards. So someone who wins a medal at the Paralympics, and I can guarantee you there are going to be medals from India at the Paralympics. I can't guarantee you that at the Olympics. I can hope for it. But they are going to get the same prize money as the Olympic athletes. In the past, women athletes was a hyphenated term. Olympic athlete was a hyphenated term as opposed to cricketer. Paralympic athlete wasn't even a hyphenated term because it wasn't even seen as an athlete. It was seen as disabled people who want to play. It was not athletes who happen to be disabled. And shifting those are all signals. And I think we've had a great opportunity and a fantastic run over the last 10 or 15 years trying to change and our hashtag, if you want to call it, is change the script. So you change the narrative of sport, which helps take care of the way that people think about it. And when you start thinking about it differently, you start acting differently. Because we, at the original point, were dealing with this issue of everyone said there's no point even trying. You're actually you'll be hitting your head against the wall. There is no culture of sport. Now, if that's the prevailing belief, what can I do? I'm not going to be able to convince people. I'm going to say, hey, Samath, you think we're terrible at sport. We're never going to be able to win. I'm not going to say, hey, Samath, actually you're wrong. Change your mind and support the movement. That's not enough, right? So, but what did we think? What is going to change your mind? If I can present you new evidence, right? I can present you new evidence and say, are you willing to re-evaluate it in the light of new evidence I've created? And in the last 15 years, we have created that new evidence. We show you that a woman from the Northeast can become a gymnast. A girl from Tamil Nadu can become a fencer. If those are possible, what is impossible? Right? And I'm now coming with a new story and saying, hey, Samath, here's the evidence of the last 8 years. Are you still of the belief that India doesn't have a culture of sport and we don't have the capabilities beyond wrestling, shooting, and boxing? Right? So signaling is important, but so is the creation of new material based on which people can change their minds. Because when minds are changed is when culture changes, and when culture changes is when behavior changes. And you're not going to be able to change people's minds simply with words. You have to show evidence and show action. And I think it's in all of our hands to be able to do such things in whatever we care about. I cared about sport, and we had a chance to work in sport, but this is transportable to anything you wish to do. And there's only so much campaigns can do in changing minds in terms of telling people change your mind. Nothing like showing people evidence, building pilot case studies, and then going back and saying, here's new material. I'm not telling you to change your mind. It's up to you to evaluate it And if you want to think afresh, you're welcome to. If you don't, I mean, there are enough other people who will. So change happens one athlete at a time, and that's the mantra we have.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Aryan?
So I had two questions. The smaller one is that for someone in the initial years of law school who wants to pursue sports law, what should he do to end up or land up at a firm like Law NK and practice sports law? And the other question is, how can you ever regulate politics in sports? Like, we of course know about the BCCI. Then we had an incident last week in the Euros with respect to Hungary, Germany, and the Euros itself regarding the stadium where they were not allowed to light the colors of the rainbow in the stadium. And it was something that was political. So can sports and politics ever be, recluse from each other, especially considering we have organizations like FIFA or the UEFA that are a association of different national associations themselves. So can it ever be possible to separate the two?
Yes. I'll take your second question first. So at a broader level, sport believes in its own neutrality, political neutrality. And I think this is important. So the principle of the autonomy of sports bodies is essentially to try and always keep the values of sport first. So the primacy of sport. And if you had political interference, and politics is not necessarily a bad word, it's essentially the prerogatives of the nation state. It's very likely that the interest of sport goes down in the hierarchy. There might be other norms. There might be the desire to win elections, the desire to be populist, the desire to fix some other problem in society, right? There might be political prerogatives which may be seen by governments to be more important than sporting interest. So the sports movement has tried its best to stay away from allowing political interference. Now, the separate point is whether politics, in some sense, is upstream of culture or downstream of culture. In many ways, sport is seeing this as an issue of it is downstream of culture or of politics, right? So politics plays into sport, and you don't want sport to get politicized. But what we are coming to realize is sport is actually upstream also of culture. Sport is feeding into the politics of today. It is not just a product of politics, but it is many of the battles being fought are feeding back into political lives, social lives. The whole issue of human rights of people who are building stadia, host countries. For that matter, the rights of athletes themselves. We talked a little bit earlier about the commercial rights and the right to a fair share in revenue. But at a broader level, what are we doing putting athletes into hyper-competitive environments? What are we doing? Are they fighting some battle of identity for us and pushing them so far that there's also a breakdown in mental health? Huge issue today is mental health of elite athletes. Are we pushing them too far down the path of hyper-competitiveness, where they actually are sucking out humanity from them and they're effectively becoming robotic performers who we are trying to extract meaning and inspiration and emulation from at serious cost to the people who are actually participating, both physical cost as well as mental cost. So I don't think sport is going to be able to remain purely apolitical, but should the playfield be protected from political imagery? I think there's enough argument in favor. Many would argue that yes, people might want to protest, but effectively allowing someone to protest or to do something significant on the playfield or on the podium when someone's won, athletes may also have very limited capabilities to stop their countries from making them do things and make statements, right? So, let's say there's an American and an Iranian playing a match. Is the Iranian going to be forced to show some sort of aggressive measure against American capitalism or something of that nature? So there's enough to also protect athletes, and putting the mantle on them to also be political and politicians and take forward movements can be highly high pressure, because then effectively the ones who don't protest are going to be under severe pressure, right? Where in these new movements, the failure to protest is seen as something that is going to be attacked as well. So there is some value in protecting sport from many of the other battles, because sport within itself is fighting a lot of these battles in ways that may not be fully respected. And I think there's enough pressure on high performance athletes than having to add new elements of having to fight non-sporting battles on the sports field. I mean, that's a personal view. It's a highly debatable and debated topic. Your next question, I'll just deal with. Let me hear from Aryan first. I think that's going a little bit outside the topic of the substantive discussion. I'm happy to answer it, but I think there's more. Aryan, yeah.
Yes, sir. So, as so that because of the lack of regulation in sports contracts in particular as well, how do you when we talk about ancillary terms like data collection and performance data, whether athlete will not really care about them because because as you said, it's a take it or leave it situation, and they can, if they reject to them, the employer can easily find another replacement for them. Do you think it's we can recognize the doctrine of unconscionability in sports contracts, considering how these happen at very unequal with unequal bargaining power? Because so yeah, essentially that.
Yeah, so this is a huge debate on which is meaningfulness of consent, right? So one, what is the consequence of not consenting if you're excluded? And two, is it even being presented in a manner that is understandable, explained, and capable of being understood before consent is granted? So that's why I think we had the discussion earlier as well of having bodies like an ombudsman to mediate the terms under which data is collected, participation is undertaken, because there's really at this point no one standing for the athlete. So can you take standard form contracts terms of unconscionable, disproportionate bargaining position? Yes, but you have to action that. You have to action it through structure and institutions. It is not going to be about the athlete having the opportunity to say, hey, I don't want to play, and give me an alternative event to go and play at where these terms are not there and where my data is not going to get collected. So you have to accept the reality that this pyramid of sport helps the universality of sport. So there are values to building a common pyramid, but at the same time, entry to that pyramid should not be on terms that are unconscionable, if you want to use that term, and some moderation, recognizing that this is not just a regulatory exclusive pyramid, a regulatory monopoly, but also an economic monopoly where athletes' livelihoods and lives are involved, right? So the reality is staying out of the pyramid can be a principal call, but it effectively also becomes a livelihood call. And it becomes one which you cannot afford, not just afford as at a conceptual level, but afford at a basic economic level to exclude yourself from. So I think lots of battles are going to be fought on this over the next coming years. It's certainly something, if anyone's interested in data rights, completely worth following. Like I said, sport is battling on the front lines of a lot of these things. Prashasti? Prashasti, you're there? I can't hear you. So is it just me or no audio?
I think
So
we
she's
cannot
not
hear her.
also. Prashasti, I think you might be on mute. Can you just check your mic once?
Yeah, do you want to just type that message? Maybe we'll get the question from Shreya. Maybe Prashasti, you can put it into the chat box.
Hello, sir.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay, sir. So, like, my question is quite general, like, apart from the technical themes which we are discussing. So, my question is, your firm was the official law firm for 2011 ICC Cricket World Cup. So, if you could share with us the challenges that you faced there and the opportunities that you witnessed. So, like, kind of your experience that you have had there.
Yeah, so that was in very context. The issue was around the whole commercial rights structure of the World Cup and what is called ambush marketing. I don't know if you're familiar with. Essentially, the people trying to claim that they were sponsors of the World Cup when they were not actually sponsors. So this was a very interesting project around protecting the revenue streams, which is even broadcast rights. So the rebroadcasting of YouTube clips, live streams of the match. So protecting the broadcast rights, protecting the sponsorships. So where someone is not a sponsor of the ICC World Cup, they claim to be a sponsor. So trademark protection and various different things that went with that. So also within the stadium, making sure that people didn't walk in with competing products, T-shirts having logos, which if it's Pepsi is the sponsor, they wear Coca-Cola logos. So they're constantly people trying to ride on the a sports event and to benefit from it commercially when they have not paid in to participate. And the broader principle of sport is people can take from sport, private participants like sponsors, broadcasters, but that is premised on them giving to sport. So if you invest in sport, you can take back maybe at a profit. But those who are not investing in sport are not actually contributing to making the event happen. And in the ideal sense, anyone trying to benefit from IP in some sense is extracting from sport, privately extracting without investing in sport. So I think that's the broad remit we had, which was protecting the commercial rights structure of the World Cup. We've done that many times over as well. So that's both digital and offline, illegal advertising, ambush marketing, piracy of broadcast streams, a whole variety of things like that. So it was a very interesting project. It's now over 10 years ago, but remains one of the interesting ones we've worked on. Yeah, so I think thank you, sir. Prashasthi's question is, do you think it's a good time now that we start thinking about bringing in policy intervention for protection and promotion of the mental health of Indian athletes? First being under the medical code of IOA ahead of Tokyo Olympics, where the athletes face high amounts of stress and anxiety. Or it will be too idealistic to go into such framing, considering there are many infrastructural issues prevalent in the field of sports at various levels. So I think it's a good question, Prashasthi. I don't know if there's going to be time to do that 1 month from the event. These are all broader structural changes. But if you see the trajectory of how sports law evolves in any jurisdiction, first it's transactional commercial law. So transactions start happening, money starts coming into sport. And some of it is dependent on how well it is regulated. But the minute more money comes in, regulatory aspects of sport come into play, which is, you've seen the LODA committee, you've seen the National Sports Development Code, better governance required because there's money. Earlier, no one cared about the governance as much because there's really not that much at stake, at least seen as not that much at stake. There was a huge amount at stake because entire careers were in some sense crushed under these pyramids. So it was more like the Egyptian pyramids where there was sort of no life at the bottom. But the reality is that this evolution goes from commercial law and transactional law in sport to much more regulatory law, including governance, anti-doping, and other things. And the third realm is really the concept of athlete rights, which we talked a little bit about in terms of broadcasting, but also the concept of athlete welfare and safeguarding. So rights merging into welfare, and that is physical welfare, psychological safety also. So physical safety is just physical safety, not being overtrained, being in physically safe places, being protected from sexual harassment. The broader psychological safety is the failure, the sort of the absence of methods which cause psychological harm to athletes. It could be methods of punishment, hyper-competitive environments, and that molds into also just mental health codes of what is permissible, what is not, as well as support systems and structures. The concept of athlete safety is quite wide. The human rights aspects are coming in, workers' rights aspects are coming in, but at a broader level, where is it going to be? Is it economic rights and that's where it stops, the right to an equal share? Or is it also safer environments to train in and not over extraction, like we talked about hyper-competitiveness, not being pushed to walls in sort of this mythical quest for humanity, right? So you're playing for the sake of humanity, and we've heard that term before. How much are you willing to be pushed and how much do you have the right to say no is part of a significant debate. Can we have that before the Tokyo Olympics? I don't think the time is adequate. Do we need that in the structures? Yes, that is the third realm after better commercial laws and better regulation and dispute resolution. The third realm is, are you going to be recognizing the participants and the creators of sports and giving them a fair go in not just the commercial pie, but in better treatment and bringing in a human rights element into the discussion as well. I hope that answered your question. Yeah, I think we have Saurabh.
Yeah. So this is the last question I think I have. So basically, recently we saw that Ronaldo removing the Coke bottles from the press conference, and Pogba also removing the Heineken bottles from the press conference. So, considering the fact that the sporting authorities like UEFA and all of them have sporting like sponsorship contracts with like the third parties like Coke, and like these actions of the players are actually counterproductive to the goals and aspirations of these particular third party industries who enter into those partner like sponsorship agreements with the sporting authorities. So how far does the freedom of expression of a player actually extends to, considering the fact that they are within the wider framework, uh, like they are within the wider framework of the sporting authority and sponsor?
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly sponsor commitments, and all player contracts have the right to do, or the obligation to do certain things for sponsors. I don't think things like this are regularly contemplated, which is essentially removing products from view and stuff. But there will be sort of covenants not to denigrate or put down a product. But a broader question that is coming up is the broader concept of sports washing. And I don't know if you're familiar with that term, is that we give so much value and spirit and respect to sport, and anyone who is associated with sport gets the rub-off effect. So the benefit, the respect we give to sport, the values of sport are rub-off on many allied both sponsors and other things like that. So the bigger question athletes are asking, and it could be from a religious element, should Islamic athletes be forced to promote alcoholic products when it goes against religious norms? At a broader level, should an athlete in this bundle of an event be forced to be promoting, maybe not directly, but indirectly, a brand that they do not necessarily agree with, and that there's a basis to not agree? It could be on health terms, it could be on these things like ethical terms like gambling. There's a huge issue on right now on whether gambling companies should be allowed on jerseys of premiership teams, because it's not just about the money, it's also about the subliminal messaging. And the real question is it leading to not just gambling addictions, but early introduction to gambling among the youth, simply because of the normalization. If it's seen on the football jersey, it's as normal as it gets, right? It's in the center of culture. So there's a huge battle on between what sponsors a body should take, first of all, and then secondly, we haven't got to that realm yet of the right to reject. We've seen that in a few, like I said, IPL contexts where certain players have removed surrogate alcohol brands off their jerseys, but those are sort of more one-offs. The broader movement is going to be interesting to watch in terms of whether groups of athletes and even athlete unions at some point are going to start rejecting certain categories of products as possible sponsors. And gambling companies is a very obvious one. It's very possible that snacks and junk food and sugar drinks could be the next realm, because in some sense there's a huge dissonance, right? But you're arguing for fitness and healthy lifestyle, and on the other hand, the thing that is promoting it is McDonald's and Pepsi and Coke. So there's that whole debate that is going to come up. It isn't at the center yet, but I think incidents like this are strong signals that tide is turning. You're also seeing much more protests at not necessarily commercial protests, but protests on movements like Black Lives Matter and other things at sporting venues, sports bodies stepping back. So FIFA would have normally sort of sanctioned teams, and actually FIFA chose to not even execute on its own rules in response to Black Lives Matter. I wouldn't call them protests, but demonstrations. Yeah, hopefully that answers your question. And just coming back to, I think, Arya's question, in terms of careers in sports law, I think it's important to know this is not like an enormous field. I think the important thing is to be interested in the understanding of sport and the interaction with society, the interaction with business, the interaction with law. There aren't that many opportunities to become a specialized sports lawyer, and for that matter, I wouldn't even recommend it as your first port of call. I would always encourage you to explore multiple different areas. And my theory is also that sports law is not a specialization. It's in many ways what I would call a deep generalization. So you need to know literally, I mean, we've talked about at least 8 or 10 different areas of law. And I mean, like I said, name the subject in your 5 years and that is covered in it. So going and exploring, understanding how to become a lawyer first, but keeping a sports lens on. So constantly using the analytical frameworks you're building, the legal frameworks and skills, and connecting them to sports contexts regularly. So whether you end up at a sports law firm, and there really aren't that many, even if there's any, there are firms that work with sports clients and sports industry, but doing multiple different things. You can craft yourself into a sports lawyer, if there is such a term, by simply becoming an excellent lawyer and keeping that hat on, because opportunities will find you. At the time when I started, there wasn't a single person doing sports law. But I mean, I made my intention clear to myself. I just started understanding what was happening in sport at a very ground level, much more sort of what's happening with athletes, what are the transactions going on. And you will find a way, and people will find you if you make your intention clear and signal to the outside world that you are a good lawyer, you've developed these multifarious skills, but also have a specific interest in sport. For all you know, there'll be many, many more firms. I'm optimistic this field is going to grow, but it's not going to grow into a field where there's room for 150 like infrastructure lawyers or maybe 500 intellectual property lawyers. There's only so much going on in sport, and all firms are doing a little bit of transactions here and there. So that is both a sort of a limitation, but also an opportunity that wherever you end up, whether in litigation, transactions, policy, if you have a love and interest in sport, there is no reason that you can't continue to feed it and to have it grow and to sort of continue your deep engagement with it. In some ways, sports will always find you if you're willing to invest in it. Yeah, so I think that's it.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. This was really an engaging and enlightening interaction, and it is indeed an honor to learn from you on the realms of sports in terms of gender, IPR, technology, data protection, etc. That being said, I would like to invite Srishti Solanki to deliver a vote of thanks.
Thank you very much. A very good evening, sir. On behalf of the Informal Discussions Group NGOs, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to you. We are extremely honored that you graced us with your presence today. It is indeed our pleasure to have interacted with you, and I'm sure each one of us is taking away something valuable from this immensely insightful session. I would like to thank you for enlightening everybody present here on a very interesting topic, that is, why sports matter, where we got to delve in deeper into gender aspects of sports, along with insights on intellectual property rights in sports, technology and data privacy as well, among other areas of laws. I would also like to thank the members of the committee who contributed in making this session a great success. I would extend my heartfelt gratitude to the members of the faculty and other attendees for their graceful presence and bringing up such wonderful questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone. Thanks for the invitation and all the best on your careers. I think it's important to stay positive and difficult times, but I'm sure all of you will emerge. And I think certainly important to also not be cynical. It's very easy as you move to your 4th and 5th years to say, okay, I'm just here to now get a job and law school means nothing to me. And I think it's important to keep that just excitement about the law and recognize the value that you will be able to bring as a lawyer. Like I said, I'm a lawyer first, but I'm also many different things, and it's a very powerful profession. And I think it's not like you need to feel a great burden or responsibility, but I think constantly you're going to be dealt with these doubts and cynicism. I think you have to constantly ward them off and fight them off, because I think there's so many interesting things to work on, and I think you're all so talented and have got the privilege of a great education, and I hope all of you use them positively. Yeah, thank you. Have a good.
Thank you so much, sir.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir.